Today, I am proud to be bringing you the deck that I piloted in the 207-player Ascent Houston Path of Steel tournament to a 9th place finish. Yes, missing out on top 8 on literally tiebreakers. This is the Fire Hybrid Merlin and Lorraine triple threat deck. Let's check it out. What's up everyone, it's Dan with Main Deck, back finally from Ascent Houston, and what an event it was. It was such an absolute pleasure meeting so many of you. I was so excited to have so many people coming up, saying hi to me, telling me about how you learned how to play Grand Archive from our videos. It was just incredible. What a wonderful weekend, and honestly, I am extremely proud of how I did and how our team was able to do, picking up the deck without even quite as much experience as myself as well. We all took the very same deck to Ascent Houston, and I happened to be the one with the most experience piloting it. I got some pretty good matchups. You know, a little bit of luck, a little bit of skill. We ended up making 9th place with this deck. A winning record to be able to make it into top cut, but I was the lone player who missed out on the beautiful CSR Spirit of Fire on tiebreakers. So it happens in tournaments. That's part of the game. But I today am happy to present to you the deck that we played. The entire team played this deck. Nobody had a terrible showing. Everybody was in to get top 32 very deep into the event, but ended up just having a little bit of bad luck, a few misplays, that kind of stuff. And we were able to ultimately at least get my deck into 9th place, as well as in the 64-player side event on Sunday. Main Deck team member Adam actually won the event with I think he made slight modifications to this list, which I'll talk about at the very end of this video. But let's just kind of jump right in and start talking about this list, because there is a lot to say. Now, if you saw our first FTC deck profile on Fire Merlin Triple Threat, this is an iteration, I guess, of that deck. And so that list, that profile had a lot of very good information. It's slightly different, but also very meaningfully different from that list as well. So without any further ado, I'm just going to jump in and explain what we're going for here. Now, the thing to realize with this deck is we are, of course, playing Fire. So we're using Spirit of Fire. But you'll notice right away, and this is the thing that I think caught a lot of opponents off guard as well, we are running not only Lorraine level 1, but also Lorraine level 2 and 3 in our deck, with also Merlin level 2 and 3. This was a very late, I guess, adjustment or evolution of the deck, where we realized that this deck lost very little from going to Lorraine in the correct matchups when the correct hand showed up, but gained quite a bit of versatility getting to level 2 Lorraine. We initially started just by going to level 2 Lorraine, and then realized, well, sometimes the opponent interacts with our kill and then we can't finish them. And it would be really nice to be able to go to a Crux champion to be able to kind of go off with our Ascension combos. So we made room and we put in Lorraine level 3 as well, not even in the sideboard. And you may wonder, why aren't we running these champions in the sideboard and we're running them in the main? The key to this entire deck, the thing that you need to realize going into this deck, is that this deck is 100% about adaptation and the element of surprise. This deck, the concept of triple threat that we started from the very first deck profile that we did on this, is the idea of running multiple different ways to kill your opponent, all of the powerful fire spells and abilities and attacks that kill your opponent. So Rending Flames, Erupting Rhapsody, and Fireball. This is where the name comes from, the triple threat. Flames, Rhapsody, Fireball. You have all three available to take your opponent out, but you are going to draw sort of different combinations of them game to game. And the realization we had was that by putting Lorraine in here at level 2 and 3, as well as Merlin 2 and 3, you could really base what your champion was each game on which cards you ended up drawing. So the games where you draw multiple copies of Rending Flames, Lorraine level 2 becomes a very enticing champion to go to, because you can push multiple 10 damage Rending Flames quite easily using Lorraine. as well as only really missing out on Fireball as the kind of the only, the only kill spell that is no longer very live with her, just because it costs a lot more. But Lorraine is just as easily able to throw Erupting Rhapsodies as Merlin is, even if Merlins are naturally a little stronger in the late game. Merlin is your usual go-to with this deck. You want to be going into Merlin whenever the game appears to be going long, whenever your hand is, kind of stacked with fireballs and it's looking like a reasonable route. The other thing about Lorraine is that Lorraine offers a little more health, and this small amount of extra health is actually quite impactful, and it can put you just out of range of your opponent taking you out, as happened directly to me in the very, I guess, I don't try not to use this word too much, but the honestly very epic match with Crown to try and get into top 32. Getting that little bit of extra health is sometimes exactly what you need to put yourself out of range, as well as, again, Lorraine just providing that sort of mix-up that the opponent isn't quite expecting. So, half of our material deck is champions in here. The next two cards we have are Sword of Adversity and Sword of Seeking. In the initial build, we only ran Sword of Seeking. The addition of Sword of Adversity comes partially from just focusing in on we added Hone by Fire to the deck as well, so that this kind of combination to just win the game sometimes on turn 2. Yes, I did that during Ascent as well. I had an opponent where I drew the Nuts hand. I went first. I did triple Increasing Danger. They materialized their Spirit. And then I went again. They did not have anything to protect themselves. They were playing fire as well. So I just went in Hone, Sword of Adversity, Rending Flames for 14 damage. And then I played a Hasty Messenger and did the 15th to them. So this deck can steal early game wins, as well as just having so much power in the late game. And that's where Sword of Adversity becomes very important. Sword of Adversity and Seeking are going to be materialized game to game, match to match, just depending on what makes sense. Again, depending on what your hand looks like. Sword of Seeking generally better for doing a little bit more board control, which is what you have to do against ally decks. And we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. Sword of Adversity sometimes needed for board control when allies are just too big. Like, you need to kill that Arthur right away, guys. You can't let that Arthur sit on the board. So if this is where your damage source is to kill the Arthur, so be it. That's what you have to do. But you just kind of select which sword makes the most sense match to match and game to game, and do your best to try and just have a sword available when it's time to go to Crux and go off, but we'll talk about that in a little bit as well. We have two Crux swords, Sword of Avarice and Prismatic Edge. Again, the point of these is to go off with Spirit Blade Ascension and Cruxite to either draw a million cards with Sword of Avarice, or we have the Prismatic Edge in here as a wonderful option to use this ability to control the board. You can, for example, instant speed Ascension the Edge in to kill a Gildas when it attacks you. All sorts of cheeky things you can do with Prismatic Edge, and if you're ever facing against win decks, it becomes very devastating for the opponent to loop this. And it's a loop that you want to keep in mind. It's not always correct to go straight into Avarice, although it often is, because drawing a lot of cards is the key to just kind of going over the top and killing your opponent, and that's what that's really for. We have Crystal of Empowerment here, and there was some debate internally in the team about whether or not this should be a more defensive slot, something else. How useful is this really? I would not cut this for the world, guys. This card enables so many wins out of nowhere that your opponent isn't expecting, and you need to be thinking. Another thing about this deck is you need to be doing the math every single turn. You start your turn, you wake everything up. At your materialized phase, you sit there and you do your math. You have to do the math to make sure you're not missing your kills here. And one step of the math is noticing when Crystal of Empowerment gets you the extra levels to get kills. Or another thing you can do with this out of the board, Disintegrate has this high 8 cost with efficiency. I had a game where I materialized Crystal of Empowerment to bring myself from level 6 to 8, making my Disintegrates free. Disintegrate Majestic Spirit, Disintegrate Nullifying Lantern, go to town. That's the kind of thing that you are able to do when you have access to Crystal of Empowerment. It makes Verican Acolytes online. That was relevant sometimes. It just does a lot of stuff. It adds damage to Rhapsody. It adds damage to Fireball. I love this card. It is so good in here. And then, of course, Grand Crusader's Ring is in here because, we need to have something to try and draw some cards with occasionally. You need to get that extra card. So instead of running Quicksilver, we are with no defensive tools anyway. Quicksilver wouldn't make a lot of sense here, so it is Ring. So let's jump into the main deck. And again, we did talk about this in sort of the initial deck profile. The main changes you'll see in here are the addition of Hone by Fire, the adjustment of the Dungeon Guide and Verican Acolyte numbers. But all of this goes hand in hand with kind of going this multi-champion route as well, so let's talk about that. Very basic stuff in this deck, your ways to draw cards. This deck is about drawing a million cards as soon as possible. You want these early game turns to be all velocity. Increasing danger. Remember, increasing danger, yes, it draws both you and your opponent cards, but in this deck, your cards are going to go over the top of your opponents most of the time. The only matchup where increasing danger gets kind of scary is fire aggro, because giving them extra tools can help them get the kill on you before you can level safely out of that kill range. Otherwise, I mean, if they're playing wind or water, you just slam the dangers. You just off cooldown, drop your increasing dangers, draw a million cards, because you need to have enough cards so that when you level, you are able to immediately during recollection step or immediately during main phase if it's through a dungeon guide, start doing your Spirit Blade Ascension combos before your opponent can try and get you a little off kilter with Tithe Proclamation or something. And so you can just be ready to go off on your opponent and deal with whatever they have. Creative Shock, one of the best feeling cards in the game. Extremely good card. Obviously, it just filters through your deck. Obviously, Increasing Danger also puts fire element cards in the graveyard, and that's important. Creative Shock does that too, and lets you pitch Floating Memory. Cremation Ritual is in here because we're going to play some allies, and we're just going to get rid of them right away. Draw more cards. You don't need to let these allies sit there. Occasionally, you can actually put some ally pressure on the opponent. Things like Flame Rune Swordsmen actually do a decent amount of work at putting a little bit of pressure on your opponent, but it's not that important. It's not as critical usually as getting it in your graveyard. So Cremation Ritual, draw some cards, get ready to go. That's all you really want to do there. Clumsy, deals damage to you, draws a card, is a fire element card. When you cremation it, goes in the graveyard, or when it just dies normally, because opponents are going to kill it anyway. So you can't cremation it. They're going to be like trying to keep you off of that, so they'll be attacking these things. Hasty, same thing, puts fire cards in the yard, draws cards, puts Floating Memory in the yard. Flame Rune Swordsman, Floating Memory. Honestly, this is when you're sideboarding, by the way, some of this package is usually what you're cutting for some of these slots. We'll talk about that a little bit at the end, but you really want as much velocity as possible, but sometimes you'd rather just have the tools. And if your goal is to go to level 3, you don't really want to cut your Crux Element cards, because that's sort of antithetical to that goal of getting to level 3 and going off. So usually you kind of cut just like a smattering, like a bunch of one-ofs in this package. But depending on the matchup, Flame Rune Swordsman is one that can go out like against Fire Merlin decks. You really don't want to give your opponent the edge on being able to banish your Floating Memory and level. And as a Fire Merlin player here, you will get used to this play of like, okay, attack your Floating Memory thing, then Dungeon Guide to level 2, and then banish it. That's what your opponent's going to do on you too. So Flame Rune Swordsman is only really a liability in the Merlin matchup, but sometimes not even, because you'll either have the advantage, you'll be going a little faster, you'll banish your own Flame Rune Swordsman. It can be very beneficial. There were a ton of plays where my goal was actually to discard or banish my own Floating Memory, not like potentially even choosing not to materialize with Floating Memory so that I could banish it with Merlin level 2 myself, because the key to this deck is really getting to 1 level counter on Merlin before you level to Merlin level 2 or level 3, so that you can immediately start to get advantage from her ability. And so sometimes you're going to want to do that, which is why these Floating Memory cards are very useful. Although again, in just like a Fire Merlin Mirror, I would probably cut out a couple of these for some of the other cards that you need. Verican Acolyte is at 4, and why is Verican Acolyte at 4? Well, it's pretty obvious. Nullifying Lantern and Quicksilver Grail are going to do a lot of work to hamper you. And I'm going to be really clear. They hamper you. They do not shut this deck down by any means. I'm going to come out and say right now, and I'm like, for the one time in my life, I'm going to use this placement to sort of push this take of mine, but Erupting Rhapsody isn't dead. Quicksilver Grail and Nullifying Lantern, I think I said Amulet earlier. Quicksilver Grail and Nullifying Lantern do not kill Erupting Rhapsody. Not even close. Verican Acolyte, being a powerful force in the late game, able to deal a lot of damage to the opponent or clear out allies, is able to, on enter, pop any Quicksilver Grail, force the pop of the Quicksilver Grail, or pop the Nullifying Lantern that's in your way, as well as being able to hit lots of targets in this Merlin Mirror match, for example. Hitting your opponent's sword, or in a Lorraine match as well, hitting your opponent's sword will stop them from killing you sometimes. You just have to be aware that is a play that is very important, even against Wind Merlin, against Water Merlin. If you can hit the sword at the right time, you slow them down an entire turn. Acolyte more than earned its 4 of spot in the deck. The biggest thing you have to do is just make sure you are respecting the Acolyte If you draw 2 Acolytes, sometimes pitching that Acolyte is not a good idea because your opponent might be trying to bait out your Acolytes on their swords and then drop the Nullifying Lantern afterwards, or drop Quicksilver into Lantern afterwards. Now, you can get them to pop Quicksilver Grail by playing any of your spells. If you posture like you're about to go for the kill with an Erupting Rhapsody, even without an Ember Song in play, if you have like 9 cards in hand, you go Erupting Rhapsody. The opponent's going to expect you're going Rhapsody, Fireball, Fireball, and they will pop their Grail to get the Lantern in play. Then you can freely Acolyte the Lantern away, and next turn, go ahead and go off. You have multiple ways of really getting to that Lantern and then eating it. The only time you can't get to that Lantern and eat it is against a water deck, which fracturizes the Lantern using that new layering rule where Lantern is still active even though it's been fracturized. Yes, that is a thing. There are some videos in the Grand Archive YouTube about that you can check out. I saw them come up right away, so I didn't bother to pop one out, but that's fine, because you know what? Against water, they are so slow, they apply so little pressure that Merlin level 3 will be able to take them out eventually anyway, so you don't really have to worry about it that much. But Acolyte, wonderful card. I would not go down on this. It is so important. It is the reason you're able to get those kills on decks that are playing Nullifying Lantern easily, but it's also really good in tons of other matchups as well, and it's just an incredible card. Tempered Steel is Floating Memory. I'm not even sure I ever hardcast it once during Ascent. I did in testing occasionally, but I'm not sure I ever did. I think I always just was able to pitch it, and that's really what you want to do. Honed by Fire. Now, we moved these into the list because, again, this gives you that ability to get early kills or string together another late-game combo to get kills. Honed by Fire is an incredible card. One of the strongest phases in this game, in this deck, and probably in this game, is the Recollection phase. Honed by Fire is yet another card you can, before recollecting, play to target your sword to give it the damage and the durability counter, and that lasts until end of turn. Then you recollect your hand, and then you're able to go ahead and play more Hone into a Rending or something. It gives you that action economy by playing it during the Recollection phase. Honed by Fire was a card I super underrated, but it has certainly earned its place in here. It's very, very powerful to be able to set up those Rending Flame swings. So it is, yeah, that's what it's here for. You get early kills with it, or it's another way to push damage late. Rending Flames does a ton of damage. The biggest flaw with Rending Flames is it is more easily defended than cards like Fiery Momentum. I'll talk a little bit about this at the end, but one of the future directions we're considering with this deck, and we're starting to test, is going with Fiery Momentums instead of Rending Flames, and I think there are pros and cons there. Fiery Momentums cannot steal games early like Rending Flames can, but in the late game, they play better with Erupting Rhapsody, even though you usually have enough fire cards where it's not really a huge deal. I want to point out one thing while I'm here too. A lot of people may also think that the prevalence of Scavenging Raccoon, especially in win decks with Displace, would put you out of this deck being playable. Also, completely overblown. Scavenging Raccoon is a card that in like fire aggro matchups, they're going to be playing just as a body on the board that is going to slow you down. Slowing you down is what it does. It does not shut you down at all. Rending Flames only requires 3 fire cards to set up. That's remarkably easy to do. And Rending Flames actually tends to be probably your strongest route to take in that sort of fire aggro matchup. Going to Lorraine is already a good idea to get the extra health, and Rending Flames ends up just being a very worthwhile late game play, especially if you end up going to Spirit Ruler and getting back your Sword of Adversity or something. So I definitely appreciate that Rending Flames when you're being pummeled by raccoons is something that is a little easier to pull off to still do a massive amount of damage. But the biggest issue is just that Resolute Stand and Deflecting Edge and cards like that reduce this damage by 6 instead of 3 like it does in Fiery Momentum. So I think there's pros and cons, and if you're going to take this list and modify it, play it yourself, you can consider the Fiery Momentum route or the Rending Flames route. I think there are pros and cons to each of them. Ember Song and Erupting Rhapsody. Ember Song being the melody, it does damage to things, and Erupting Rhapsody being the harmony that absolutely destroys your opponent. But a thing you want to realize with this deck is that I think a lot of people pick up this deck and they go, okay, all my win con cards, these are sacred cows, I need them to win the game, I'm not going to mess around with playing them or losing them to memory, and that is going to be the wrong way to play this deck. Feel free to put down Rending Flames, Rhapsodies, Ember Songs, Fireballs, put them into your memory. It's okay. The key to this deck is you're going to draw so much more, so much later. Another thing you want to do with this deck is consider playing Embersong and Rhapsody as control cards. If you are facing off against especially like Wind allies, but also Fire allies decks, Embersong into Rhapsody early on, banishing maybe even nothing, but you know, a couple cards is fine, whatever, to get damage on the board to like more or less 2 for 3 your opponent or something. That's going to set them back more than it might feel like at first, because those ally decks are often relying, Fire less so, but Wind especially so, are relying on keeping units on the board in order to continue to put pressure on the opponent. And if you can spend a couple of your, you know, million win con cards to deal with the chunk of the opponent's win con cards that are currently in play, you are going to get a big tempo advantage, and that's exactly what you need in order to get to your level 3 and start to draw your cards and start to go off on the opponent. I have definitely won games from using that Erupting Rhapsody to control the board, and if you make sure you stay open to that idea, you will too. But otherwise, of course, Erupting Rhapsody is part of key combos in the deck. Embersong, Rhapsody, Fireball represents a ton of damage. Rhapsody, Fireball without Embersong still represents a ton of damage, because Rhapsody can just rocket your level up to the high levels, and then 2 Fireballs will kill almost every champion in the game, especially if you've dealt any amount of damage earlier. Rhapsody, Fireball, Rending Flames is another way to get enough damage to get the kill. The point of this deck is just stringing together any mix of those things to go ahead and get the kill. Remember that Rhapsody is a skill and not a spell. That's very important because it can hit things with Spell Shroud. Innervate Agility does not prevent it from dealing damage to you with the Spell Shroud part of it. So sometimes you're going to play a Merlin match where they're going to get a Deer in play. Rhapsody is a wonderful way to clear the Deer and get a little bit of damage on the opponent. Remember, Deer's damage prevention effect will apply to the Rhapsody that is resolving, even if that Rhapsody is killing the Deer, because the damage is all dealt at once, and then the Deer is killed. So you're going to only deal half damage to the opponent, but damage is damage. It'll get you there, and then that'll clear the way for you to just Fireball your opponent out of the game. It's just, Rhapsody is incredible. Rhapsody is an absolutely incredible card. It does so much damage, and the biggest flaw is that Lantern exists. And as I said earlier, it's not a big deal. Even if Lantern is in play, and you just let the game go late enough, you control the game, your opponent's not putting enough pressure on you, Erupting Rhapsody can still deal level damage to your opponent. It's just Fireball -1. It's just Fireball -1 for the same cost, as long as you can activate an Embersong that turn. So you're still going to get to the point where this is going to deal 6, 8, 9, 10, whatever damage. You know, keep in mind Crystal of Empowerment will power it up as well. But the big thing is just like the level counters from Merlin. She's just going to keep getting levels. Merlin is such an incredible champion because she has a built-in inevitability to her. So this deck plays both routes. It plays early game, it plays late game. Fireball does a ton of damage. Fireball can be used to control things. Fireball, only flaw when you go to Lorraine is it costs 4 instead of 2, and don't get me wrong, that's a ton, but it is still a viable piece to control the board, killing key like Ascent Protectors, Phalanx Captains, whatever you need to get rid of, it is available to that for that as well. And it's fast speed. Remember, you can play this during Recollection Step, especially to like bait out your opponent's interaction pieces early on, like Veiling Breeze or something right away, letting you then play your turn exactly around that, or just, you know, then recollect and go, okay, pass. All right, your turn. Now I'm going to Fireball you. So you can definitely do all that stuff. It's so good. Dungeon Guide. This is probably going to be the most controversial slot in this deck just because it's only out of 2 of. And I will say that after playing the entire event, in the current metagame, I do think it should maybe be at least 3. That was one of my takeaways playing through the event. Now, the reason we put this at 2, theory-wise, was that keep in mind you play more games with Sideboard than without. In your entire lifetime, you will play more games with a Sideboard than without a Sideboard, because you will always play at least 1 game pre-side, 1 game post-side, but you will sometimes play 2 games post-side. You will never play 2 games pre-side. So the theory was that we have a lot of cards in here that like I don't want to move the numbers on, all the kill condition cards. We have a lot of cards in here that are velocity cards that are going to help. You need to see those early on to generate that sort of velocity in your cards to be able to get to those high levels as fast as possible. Dungeon Guide is a card you only want to see 1 of in a lot of games. 2 is very rarely used. 1 is usually just fine. And the thought was that in that first game, I really want to get the perfect mix of velocity. I don't want to start my game one off without seeing my velocity, and I only want to see one copy of Dungeon Guide. Thus, we would sideboard in the extra copies of Dungeon Guide when a matchup required us to go fast. And matchups that can require you to go fast are like Fire Aggro, Fire Rye for sure. They're really just like kind of fire mirrors, I guess. Sometimes the aggressive like Wind Allies decks can get good enough starts where you need to level a little bit faster to stay ahead of them. But usually it's just fire decks that you're really concerned about going faster, especially the Fire Merlin mirror, which sometimes comes down to just who gets to level 3 first. So we would side in the Dungeon Guides when we needed to go faster. Otherwise, it was just better usually just to make sure you had the velocity cards in hand in the opener. You were able to see them. And the way that played out, I just feel like, 2 felt fine, but I think 3 would have felt a little better. So one thing we're looking at for the future is just like, let's find a slot for that 3rd Dungeon Guide. I think that might have just felt a little bit smoother throughout the event. Because it is quite powerful. There are some powerful plays to be able to get to level 2. And like I said earlier, like attack, kill a floating memory unit, level to 2 with Dungeon Guide, and immediately banish that before the opponent gets to use the floating memory. That kind of stuff really shifts the tempo of the game, so that's where Dungeon Guide is quite useful. But I mean, you could also play 4 as well, in the main if you feel like it's more useful, depending on your local meta. And then finally, Spirit Blade Ascension and Cruxite. I think I've talked a lot about these, but like obviously, your combo, you just do Crux things. You draw a million cards. It does cool things with Prismatic Edge. Cruxite is also a card that gets hampered by Nullifying Lantern. So you just want to find an answer to that. Be careful. Play around Tithe Proclamation appropriately. But there isn't too much to say because I think everyone's seen this combo a million times. So they're good. They're just good Crux cards. One thing people notice that we're not playing Incarnate Majesty in here. We're not playing Deer, and the reason we're not playing Deer is because everything else we're doing is too much stronger than Deer. Deer represents a good, just like Merlin 3, a good sort of inevitable endgame that you're gonna win the game eventually as long as Deer sticks out. But we didn't want eventually here. We already have inevitability with Merlin level 3. As long as we're getting levels, Fireball and Erupting Rhapsody are stronger. We're getting constantly every other turn a buff to Rending Flames to make Rending Flames do a lot of damage. The Deer just wasn't necessary. Instead, we were able to just max out on our Acolytes and make sure we have all the spots for Velocity and the Crux combos and the Dungeon Guides. It just didn't seem necessary to have Incarnate Majesty even in the sideboard. It was never really necessary. So with this deck, and before I jump into the sideboard, as I said, the key is its unpredictability and it's difficult to pin down. One thing we noticed with Grand Archive was that currently, at least in the game, almost all interaction outside of like Veiling Breeze are very specific interaction. We noticed that a lot of decks were going, okay, bring in the Peaceful Reunions against aggro, bring in the Resolute Stands against aggro, bring in the Blanches against Rye, against non-ally damage. Everyone was doing stuff like that. Sometimes mainboarding multiple copies of each, like in some of the Wind Merlin lists. And we found that as we explored this deck more, and especially as we went into sort of the Lorraine option and the Hone by Fire to power up that Rending Flame side of things, this deck was just too difficult to pin down. We tested into just about all of the metagame. I will say that in our testing, I think our Fire Aggro decks were suboptimal compared to the ones we saw being played at Ascent. So our Fire Aggro matchup was we thought it was a little better than it is. It still isn't terrible. I still won multiple matchups of those throughout the event. But our Wind matchup is very, very strong. Our Water matchup is very, very strong, almost regardless of the champion at play. Our Rye matchup felt like very coin flippy as long as you could try and get your Dungeon Guides in better post side, and that's where adding Dungeon Guides would help. But otherwise, our matchups never felt a lot worse than 50-50 against everything because no deck could really shut us down. Even when they went Quicksilver Lantern, if they're doing Quicksilver Lantern, they're usually kind of screwing around a little bit. They're not putting the same pressure on you that a fire deck would, or they're relieving a little bit of the pressure by not drawing a card or something that turn. And that usually gave you time, which allowed you to get to level 3 and then start to kind of push your own end game, regardless of Lantern being in play or finding the Acolytes to kill the Lantern. So the deck just is tough to pin down. Nothing really kills the deck. You have answers to anything that is a potential problem. And the big thing is that you just go so over the top that unless an opponent puts adequate pressure on you, you're just going to take them out eventually. If not very rapidly, if you get a solid Hone by Fire or Rending Flame start. So to that end, what did we end up playing in the sideboard? Well, we put in 3 copies of Flame Sweep. And the Flame Sweep are here to just guarantee against those win. By the way, shout out to True Champion Gaming for their winning deck list. It was a wonderful, super cool Wind Allies deck, and is exactly the reason why we have Flame Sweep in the sideboard, because siding into Flame Sweep and then surprising the opponent by going to Lorraine Blademaster and drawing a million cards off of it, against matchups like that, it takes the match for you. Very, very, very strong. So we have 3 of those in the side, and you pull them in just against ally decks. We have those 2 dungeon guides, as I mentioned. When you need to go a little bit faster, you bring those in. We also have the 4th Crux site in here, and that's because, again, this often came in as a package with the 2 dungeon guides, because you would just need to do something once you get to level 3. Go off and make sure you finish your opponent. Like against Rye, your goal is to get to 3 first, and then get to the kill right away. So it's like Dungeon Guide to 2, level to 3, and then have the cards in hand to start drawing a million cards during Recollection, so that when you pick your hand up, you have at least the 9 cards required to go Ember Song, Rhapsody, Fireball, or Rhapsody, Fireball, Fireball, or something. So it was just putting it in to make sure you saw those. And then finally, we ran 2 Disintegrates, and this was a slot we had it Spurned to Ash for a long time until we got to Ascent, and we looked around and said, oh my goodness, a lot of people are playing Merlin. Disintegrate is going to do better here, and I did not regret doing that one bit. Disintegrate was wonderful at taking out Deer, dealing with Tithe Proclamation if I wanted to, just being another answer to Lantern, or just anything else that might come up, which didn't come up too often, but yeah, big Deer killer, basically. Disintegrate is a wonderful card that you can easily get to be a free cost card, which makes your turn that much more explosive. So loved having this at 2. Something I would consider mainboarding if Merlin was everywhere in my local metagame, but I did find it just fine at 2 because we drew enough cards that we would usually be able to find one at the late game stage when we needed it against Merlin. So that is it. That is the Fire Merlin or Fire Hybrid triple threat deck that we played at Ascent Houston. Again, got 9th place in the main event Path of Steel, and then Adam from our team did win the 64-player, first place win 64-player side event on Sunday. I think using modifications, he might have been doing Fiery Momentums instead of Rendings, and maybe some other slight changes. As far as future directions, where I think we're going with this, we were very happy with how the deck performed, but I think it could be shored up depending on how the metagame looks. We are looking, like I said, at Fiery Momentum, which means taking out both Hone by Fire and Rending Flames, and we're considering the addition of cards like Slay the King. That was a very fun tech card that we started to see, and we're considering if there are any slots in this very packed material deck that we can start to remove to maybe find room for actually Tithe Proclamation is the main thing we want in here, because I think the Rye matchup gets shored up massively if you Slay the King, their Dungeon Guide, and pop a Tithe Proclamation in play, which gives you that extra materialize phase that Rye doesn't normally like to give you, which then should hopefully buy you just enough time to be able to get to 3 and go off and take the opponent out. So one of my sort of major changes to the build I'm going to start immediately testing are Fiery Momentum and Slay the King in the place of Rending Flames and Hone by Fire. The one thing I'm unsure about Slay the King is that this deck is really trying to max out on Fire for our Rhapsodies, and then for our either Rending or Fiery Momentums, and we will be adding an additional Crux card to it. But Slay the King also is just a very cool Crux card because it will allow you to take out more allies if Wind Allies continues to be popular. And you can also just bash your opponent in the face for 6 with it on an even level counter Merlin turn, which is just fine too. That's a solid amount of damage. So those are some of the directions we're thinking. I'm still not thinking about having Deer in this list because I don't think it's necessary. I do like the combination of Erupting and Deer. I think that's really cute, but you're just so much more explosive than that. But feel free, toy around, take this list. What I encourage everyone to do is take this list and innovate upon it, build upon it anyway. This was a criminally underplayed list at Ascent Houston, which has incredible matchups against some of a bunch of the decks in the top 8 would have actually been, I think, a relatively easy, or at least it would have been a difficult game for my opponent if I had made it in and was playing this. So, I think there's a lot here. I think there's a lot here to think about. And this is definitely a deck that is worth trying out, toying around with, iterating on, and finding more metagames where this is just going to be an absolute problem. Like it was for, I can say, a lot of well-known players who I had the pleasure to face and have some incredible games against at Ascent Houston. So that's going to do it for this deck profile. If you stay tuned, one of the next videos we have coming up is actually going to be a deck profile on our LGS owner. Shout out to JWW Cards, Josh Wolters, who took 5th place in the Path of Silver. So we're going to do a deck profile looking at his Path of Silver submission, which should be a lot of fun. And we'll have a few more things covering Ascent Houston coming up soon. But I wanted to make sure I got this deck profile out to you guys because I had a lot of people asking just to basically hear me talk through everything. So I know this one on very long, but I hope you found it an interesting listen. Even though we bubbled out, I'm super proud of the performance here. I think it's a wonderful deck, and I really hope you guys enjoy exploring this, playing with it, and let me know how it goes in the comments down below. Is your local meta mad at you after this now? Or are you just having an absolute blast playing it? Love to hear from you. Thank you so much for watching, and we will see you guys in the next one.